1991 was likely the worst year for the Soviet Union, partly because this year it ceased to exist, and partly because its inhabitants were forced to live in Kazakhstan for about a week. It's hard for me to say which is worse. Overall, the collapse of the Soviet Union went fairly smoothly, except for some exceptions, and in the end, it wasn't so bad. But what if everything had gone differently? What if it had turned into the fire of civil war? How to plunge the Soviet power into civil war? It's not that difficult, as something like this almost happened in real history. I would start with an attempt at a coup in 1990. Several significant figures, including Vice President Gennady Yanayev, Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, KGB head Vadim Kurik, and other ministers, attempted to overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. These people, whom I would describe as hardline communists, opposed Gorbachev's liberal reforms and his ideas of a union of sovereign Soviet republics, leading Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia to refuse participation in these reforms and strive for full independence. The irony is that this coup attempt failed in just 72 hours and ultimately accelerated Ukraine's pursuit of independence, further contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In trying to save the Soviet Union, they accelerated its end. But what if they had succeeded? First, let's understand why it failed. Historically, rigid communists united and created a state emergency committee to govern the country and effectively support the regime in times of crisis. Vice President Gennady signed a decree declaring himself acting president of the Soviet Union, stating that Gorbachev was too ill to act. The first thing the members of the GKCHP did, as I will call them, was to ban everything except 9 newspapers, declare a state of emergency in some regions of the Soviet Union, prohibit rallies, demonstrations, strikes, and suspend the activities of all political parties. Then the KGB surrounded Gorbachev's house in Crimea and blocked all entrances, including access to his private plane. The KGB compiled a list of arrests that included RSFSR President Boris Borisov and other Democrats. 4 deputies of the RSFSR People's Assembly were detained by the KGB, which became the only significant arrest during the coup, as Boris Yeltsin managed to reroute his flight to avoid Moscow. At that time, Yanayev instructed Foreign Minister Alexander Bezetnikov to make a statement requesting recognition from the UN, rather than from Gorbachev's rival government. In response, Borisov gathered all the key figures, such as the mayor of Leningrad, the deputy mayor of Moscow, and most importantly, Major General Konstantin Kobets, at his dacha near Moscow. Historically, Yeltsin sought to create a competitive government, but Colonel General Konstantin convinced him to go to the White House in Moscow, which is the parliamentary building. It was here, according to history, that Kuker-Chapa was condemned, and they seized control over the military and police. Boris, standing on a tank, inspired the people in his struggle and became more popular than Gorbachev. This proved to be the right decision, as he managed to gain the support of several major leaders, including Patriarch Alexei, head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Ultimately, he also received support from the West. As a result, Gacha-Chapa failed so badly in the coup that it ended on August 23rd, just 3 days after it began. As for the point of divergence that could lead to the success of this school, I think that the arrest of Borisov, or his establishment of a rival government, where General Colonel Konstantin Kobets cannot stop him, would be decisive. This would certainly lead to an outbreak of civil war. I propose that during the first wave of arrests, Colonel General Konstantin Kobets be detained and placed under custody. This would allow Boris Yeltsin to remain in his home with allies preparing to form a counter-government. In fact, this would have given Kakachape enough time to surround his house and ultimately arrest Borisov. In this alternative history, with Yeltsin's arrest, the coup would have actually succeeded, as they would have kept him and Gorbachev under house arrest. However, there is one serious problem. About 23.6% of Russians believe that a coup will improve living conditions, 41.9% have no opinion, and I assume the rest were against it. Moreover, many Soviet republics also did not support the coup, which would have led to new uprisings there. In this alternative history, after the arrest of Boris Yeltsin, we could witness the arrest of the mayor of Moscow. In order for the coup to establish complete control over the city, there may also be an attempt to arrest the mayor of Leningrad. However, given the overwhelming resistance of Leningrad to the coup, this seems unlikely. With the arrest of Yeltsin and Gorbachev, the new regime would technically become legitimate, but in practice, it would control very little territory. Immediately after the announcement of the successful coup, Ukraine, Moldova, and the Baltic states would declare their independence, as they had historically supported Yeltsin's regime, and with the arrival of the new regime, they would have no reason to remain part of the Soviet Union. Transnistria would have been captured by Moldova, and a brutal conflict would have continued throughout the Soviet Civil War. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Ukraine initially wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union, as it supported Gorbachev's reforms to create a union of sovereign republics. After the historical failure of this school, they sought independence. In this alternative history, this school will succeed. Thus, the rights and autonomy of Ukraine will be completely eliminated, pushing the country towards independence. Moreover, Ukraine was planning to hold a referendum on independence shortly before the coup, so I can easily imagine that they will not cooperate with the conspirators. Belarus may try to leave the Union, but it's hard to say. I couldn't find opinions from Belarusians regarding the coup, but judging by the statements of Kunkushin, who was a prominent figure in the parliament at the time, I would assume that Belarus would support the coup. Historically, the Belarusian People's Front received 37 seats out of 360 in the 12th Supreme Council of Belarus, and was the most prominent movement calling for Belarus's exit from the Union. Clearly, support for this political party was minimal, but after the failed coup, hatred towards the Soviet Union in Belarus increased, contributing to the desire for independence. In short, since the coup will now be successful, the Belarusian People's Front will not have significant support. Therefore, they will not declare independence and may remain in the Soviet Union, although the situation will be extremely unstable. Meanwhile, in the Baltic countries, these nations will officially declare independence, but will mostly be occupied by troops loyal to the communists. A few weeks after the coup, while the conspirators are still trying to organize forces for invasion and control over the breakaway territories, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic may declare its independence, with supporters of the Soviet Union backing Gorbachev. At this moment, Georgia, which declared independence in 1990, will be occupied by these factions along with Armenia. The civil war in the Soviet Union will officially begin in 1992. Before continuing, I would like to consider the three main factions of this conflict. Let's start with the conspirators, whom I will simply call the Soviet Union. They will be concentrated in Moscow and will have tight control over the surrounding territories. Regions like Belarus and the Baltics will fall under their control, albeit more carelessly. Small Soviet socialist republics in the Caucasus and Siberia will side with them, expanding to secure support for their territories. Despite the control over these territories, the population living there does not support them. As I mentioned, they have the KGB and about half of the Red Army on their side, but this loyalty is more due to circumstances than choice. Western countries will openly condemn this faction, stating that it is an illegal regime. However, if they achieve victory, Western states will reluctantly recognize them. The Gorbachev monarchy in the south, which I will simply call the monarchists, will control most of the Caucasus, along with some regions of Siberia. Considering Siberia, it is worth noting that historically, it could have come under control when Gorbachev decided to reform the Soviet Union into a union of Soviet sovereign republics, meaning the republics would have to become independent and the USSR more federal. Siberia and other autonomous republics would support this idea, but only if they received the status of their own republics and were not part of Russia. In this alternative history, I can imagine how Gorbachev's supporters would promise them exactly that, to gain their support. Part of Ukraine would also be seized, along with the occupation of Georgia. This side of the conflict would likely have the other half of the army, but who would lead it is a complex question. Their capital would likely be in Volgograd, and this regime would receive much of the Western support. As for the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, I will simply refer to them as Russians in this video. Their capital would likely be located in Leningrad, which would be renamed St. Petersburg. They would have small fragments of the Red Army, mainly on Russian territory. With Boris Yeltsin's arrest, one could assume that Putin would take the lead, and that would be correct. Although Putin worked in the KGB, he resigned during the coup. Therefore, I don't think he would have sided with them, even if the coup had succeeded. In the conditions of civil war, the Russians not only sought independence and democratization, but also expansion into the Baltic, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus. Putin is essentially trying to make Russia as powerful as possible. This is what Putin has always wanted, a great Russia. Additionally, there are several independence movements, which I will mention for simplicity. Thus, one can summarize, the fervent supporters of communism sought to preserve the Soviet Union and make it more authoritarian, claiming all its territory. Supporters of Gorbachev desired reforms and greater autonomy, and the Russians, striving for democracy and independence, would be under the leadership of Putin, who would try to expand Russia as much as possible. At this stage, we had prepared the ground for a truly brutal civil war. So let me tell you how this could unfold. First of all, the monarchists will secure control over most of the Caucasus, as they will be separated from the rest of the Soviet Union. That is, from the staunch communist supporters. I assume this step will go smoothly, as the main part of the Red Army will not be there. Ukraine will attempt to drive the enemies from its territory, but will not be able to reclaim Crimea. Soviet forces will move south, hoping to take Volgograd and suppress Gorbachev's supporters. While certain successes will be achieved, the city will not be close to falling. Meanwhile, the Russians will also move south, aiming to capture Moscow. I truly expect this operation to succeed, as the Muscovites have historically hated the coup. Moreover, at that moment, almost all city dwellers, not just those in Moscow, sharply condemned the coup. Therefore, it will be easier for Russians than you might assume to liberate cities and achieve their independence or democracy. Most Red Army soldiers supporting the coup will begin to waver, and many of them will switch to the side of the Russian Federation. Russia will also invade Estonia, prompting a strong response from the international community. Speaking of the Baltic, Lithuania and Latvia will begin to reclaim their territories, which were only weakly controlled by Soviet troops. We will see how these Baltic countries unite, hoping to ensure independence for all. Now let's move on to Central Asia. Here the events will become truly interesting. Initially, all these republics will support the communist revolution and the hardline communists, as nationalist movements are weaker there. Therefore, they will not declare their independence while local leaders remain staunch communists. They will not support Gorbachev's loyalists and, of course, will not support Putin. This will make them wish to remain part of the Soviet Union, but not because they want to. In fact, they will ultimately become a battleground in a civil war. Soviet troops and loyalists will attempt to annex these republics, while Russia will seek to join the predominantly Russian regions in the north. I believe this will lead to an invasion at some point. Simplifying greatly, Kazakhstan will declare its independence and seize the nuclear weapons located in Semipalatinsk. The Russian minorities in the north will start an ethnic conflict that will be supported by Putin. In Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov will declare independence to maintain his power and avoid conflict, which in my opinion could work. Turkmenistan will find itself in a similar situation, and its leader, Murad Saparov, will support anyone who helps him stay in power. Turkmenistan will also gain independence, but will likely support monarchists until it enters the war. Kyrgyzstan may act similarly, supporting monarchists diplomatically, but unlike Turkmenistan, not through military means. Finally, it seems to me that Tajikistan is of the greatest interest. In '91, the country was already on the brink of civil war, which actually broke out in '92. Therefore, I assume that the country may plunge into anarchy. Hardline communists, reformers, independence movements, and Islamists will seize control of the country, leading to complete chaos. In Siberia, loyalists and Kazakhs will begin to weaken Soviet influence. The Red Army in this region will be extremely poorly supplied, yet they will still try to hold on, hoping to connect with other centers of Soviet resistance. Around this time, we may observe a possible invasion of China in the Far East. Let me explain. China claimed the territory around Vladivostok for a long time, until May 1991. After signing the border agreement with the Soviet Union, when the country plunged into civil war, it is quite likely that China saw this as an opportunity to expand its borders. Since the government that signed this agreement has ceased to exist, China might not feel the need to adhere to the terms of the treaty. However, that would be too simple. Deng Xiaoping focused on economic reforms and seeking foreign allies. An invasion of Siberia would contradict his plans. Therefore, a formal attack was out of the question. Realistically, China might fear a nuclear state on its border, such as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and so on, where Soviet nuclear weapons were stationed. China could send peacekeeping forces to remote regions like the Amur region and the Zaporizhzhia Krai, where the Russian separatist state could turn to China for protection, potentially leading to the creation of a pro-Chinese Far Eastern Republic. Believe me, China will not just storm into Siberia like in a card game. Despite claiming rights to these lands, the risk of confrontation with a nuclear power and the international consequences are too great. China was still recovering from the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square events and facing internal issues in the provinces of Xinjiang, Tibet, and Guangdong. Therefore, the onset of war would have serious consequences for China. This is why China would prefer to silently support a pro-Chinese separatist state, I chose a safer option by deploying peacekeeping troops along the border and establishing a pro-Chinese puppet government. This would help China in a crisis situation, avoiding open conflict with the West, allowing for continued alliance building. With the start of 1993, Western support for the Loyalists will begin to raise questions. This is related to the fact that these forces were initially what the West wanted to eliminate. Why should they support them? I believe that as the war drags on, Western support will gradually shift to countries like Ukraine and the Baltic states, rather than to the Loyalists. NATO will begin demanding that parties leave the occupied territories of the Baltics and Georgia, although these warnings will mostly be ignored, except for the Georgian issue. With control over the Caucasus secured, the need for Georgia will diminish for Loyalists, except for territorial expansion. In hopes of regaining Western support, the Loyalists will re-establish the Georgian government, albeit with some limited influences. However, this will not bring them additional support from the West and may even have the opposite effect, activating independence movements in other parts of the Caucasus.